Bisola married the richest man in the village. Everyone said she was blessed. But a few nights after the wedding, she started hearing strange sounds coming from her husband's room. She followed the strange sound into her husband's room. What she found coiled on his bed was not a man. It was a nightmare. On the third night of her marriage, Bisola heard the sound she had been told never to listen for. It came from beneath her husband's chamber door, a slow, dry whisper, like rope being dragged across stone. She lay frozen on the bed of carved cedar, her wedding bangles silent on her wrists, and remembered the single rule Deji had given her before the priest tied their hands together. She must never open his door between the hour of the owl and the hour of the rooster. Never. Not for sickness. Not for thunder. Not for fire. The whisper crossed the corridor outside her chamber. It paused at her door. The brass handle turned slowly, the way a curious child tests a lock, and Bisola pressed her fingers against her mouth so her breath would not give her away. Then the handle stilled. The whisper retreated. And in the silence that followed, she understood she had married something the village did not know how to name. 3 weeks before that night, Bisola had been a girl who counted yams to make sure her family would eat. Her father's farm had failed for 2 harvests. Her mother coughed blood into a piece of indigo cloth and hid it beneath the sleeping mat so the children would not see. Bisola was the eldest of 4, and the weight of the household sat on her shoulders like a clay pot too full to lower. Their village, Idiroko, was folded between 2 low hills the color of dry river clay. The market sat at its center, and beyond the market, the road climbed past tall iroko trees and ended at the gates of the only stone house in the village, the house of Deji, the richest man anyone had ever known. No one remembered when he had come. No one could name his father. Deji's compound had walls of polished granite that caught the morning sun like the inside of a kiln. The great wooden gates were carved with twin serpents whose eyes were studded with green stones, and the serpents seemed to look down at every traveler who passed. His servants wore white. His storehouses overflowed even in years of drought. He gave food to the poor and paid for the village school, and he had never, in any year anyone could remember, attended a wedding. Bisola had only seen Deji once in her life. It was the morning of the New Yam festival, 2 years before her own wedding. He had passed through the market wrapped in a white agbada and a cap of dark velvet, and he had paused at the small stall where she was selling pepper. He had looked at her once with eyes the color of warm honey. He had not spoken. He had bought nothing. He had walked away. She had thought no more of it. Then one evening, as her mother shook with fever on the sleeping mat and the rain made small drums on the roof, Deji's senior servant Femi came to their compound carrying a calabash wrapped in red cloth. He set the calabash before Bisola's father in the dim light of the single lamp. He spoke for a long time, in the soft, careful voice of a man delivering bad news that was not bad. When Femi left, Bisola's father wept into his hands and laughed at the same time. Deji wished to marry her. The bride price was already inside the calabash. Bisola lifted the lid herself. Inside lay cowries, gold coins, and a folded letter sealed with green wax. She did not weep, and she did not laugh. She thought of her mother's blood-soaked indigo cloth. She thought of her 2 younger brothers eating 1 meal a day. She thought of Folake, her sister of 13, who would be married off to a worse man if the family debts grew any heavier. She closed the calabash and gave her answer before her father could ask. The next morning, Bisola stood alone at the gates of Deji's compound. The carved serpents above the arch seemed to turn their greenstone eyes toward her. The heavy gates began to open without any hand touching them, slowly, the way a sleeping mouth opens at the end of a long dream, and inside she saw a courtyard tiled in cool grey stone where Femi waited with his hands folded. Femi led her through 3 tiled hallways into a small room of polished mahogany, where Deji sat on a low wooden stool, dressed in plain white. He did not stand to greet her. He looked at her with the same honey eyes she remembered from the market. He told her the bride price was hers to keep regardless of what she answered next, and his voice carried no pressure, only a strange and patient sadness. He told her she would never be hungry again, and her family would never be hungry again, but she must keep one rule for as long as she lived under his roof. She must never enter his chamber between the hour of the owl and the hour of the rooster. Bisola asked him why. He turned his face to the window. He said it was the only question he could not answer. She thought of her mother. She thought of Folklore. She gave him her promise. Deji did not smile. He bowed his head slowly, the way a priest bows before an altar, and the bowing felt to her like a man being lowered into water. He said nothing more. Femi led her out through the same hallway, and behind her she heard a sound like a door closing very softly underwater. The wedding was held 7 days later in the open square of Idiroko. The whole village came. Drummers from 3 villages played until the sun fell behind the Iroko trees. Children climbed onto the mango branches to see better. Bisola wore ossowoke the color of palm wine, and her hair was braided into 7 thick rows, each tipped with a coral bead, and she had never felt so beautiful and so small at the same time. Deji stood beside her in white. He held her hand only when the priest tied the cloth around their wrists, and his palm was cool, like the inside of a clay pot drawn from a stream. The priest blessed them in the names of the ancestors. The drums rose. And as the cloth was untied, Bisola saw Deji glance once at the carved serpents on his own gate, and his honey eyes flickered, just briefly, into something else. Then they were honey again. That night, Bisola was led to her own chamber, far from his, in the western wing of the Granite house. The room was wider than her father's whole house. The bed was carved from cedar and laid with white linen. There was a brass bowl of oranges, a silver jug of fresh water, and a small lamp that burned with no flame she could see. Femi set down her bundle, bowed, and shut the door behind him with a click that sounded final. She did not sleep. She sat at the high arched window and watched the moon climb above the granite walls. Far down the long corridor, she thought she heard the sound of someone breathing very deeply, like a man underwater learning to be patient. When the rooster crowed at first light, the breathing stopped. Morning came soft and golden into the dining hall, where Deji was already seated at a long mahogany table. Fried plantain, roasted yam, eggs in palm oil, and a clay cup of warm cocoa had been laid out. He asked her if she had slept well. She said yes. He nodded as though he had heard her say no, and he told her quietly that the kitchen was hers, the garden was hers, the library was hers. Only his chamber, between the hour of the owl and the hour of the rooster, was not. For 2 weeks, Bisola lived as no woman in Idiroko had ever lived. She sat at the long dining table in wrappers of imported silk, surrounded by warm bread and brass bowls of fruit, and she tried to teach her hands not to shake when they reached for things they had never touched before. Each Friday, she sent goats and rice to her mother. Her mother's cough began to fade. Deji was a kind husband in those first weeks. He read poetry aloud in the evenings beneath the lemon tree in the courtyard, his voice low and rhythmic, the way the elders read in the temple. He never raised his voice. He never lifted his hand. He touched her only on the wrist, and only by accident. They had not yet shared a bed, and she had learned in her father's house that a girl who asks too many questions empties the soup pot of its meaning. On the 3rd night of her marriage, the dry whispering came down the corridor for the first time. It paused at her door. The brass handle turned. It retreated. And the next morning, when Deji lifted his honey eyes to hers across the dining table and asked her if she had slept well, he searched her face for a long moment, found nothing, and looked back into his cup. The whispering came again the next night, and the night after, and the night after that. It was always the same, the slow drag of rope across stone, the pause at her door, the gentle pushing of the brass handle, the retreat. Bisola began to count the heartbeats between the sounds. They were always the same. Whatever moved in that corridor was not random. It had a route. It had a purpose. She asked Femi about it on the 5th morning, casually, the way a woman asks about the weather, as he set down a tray of bread. Femi did not answer. His hands trembled. He turned and walked out of the dining hall without a single word, and Bisola understood that a servant who cannot answer is a servant who has been ordered not to know. On the 7th night, she lit a small clay lamp beside her bed and sat upright on the cedar frame, her back against the wooden headboard. She did not look at the door. She listened. The whispering came at the usual hour. It paused. The brass handle turned, and this time the door cracked open the width of a coin. She lifted the lamp higher. The light spilled into the corridor. She saw nothing. The corridor was empty. The door swung open further. The whispering was right beside her bed now, low and patient, and the lamp's flame bent sideways as if pushed by a breath she could not feel. She closed her eyes. She prayed, not to any god she had been taught about, but to her grandmother who had died of a fever when Bisola was 9. She asked her grandmother to please, take whatever was in the room away. The flame straightened. The whispering retreated. The door drifted shut on its own. Bisola did not sleep. She lay on the cedar bed and watched the moon move across the window the way a wound watches a clock. In the morning, she did not go down to breakfast. Deji came to her door but did not enter. He stood in the corridor and asked her through the wood if she was unwell. She told him she was tired. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, very softly, that the rule was made to protect her, and he asked her not to forget it. He left without waiting for her answer. That afternoon, Bisola walked into the village and went to see Aya Yemi, the oldest woman in Idiroko, who lived in a thatched house behind the schoolhouse and was said to remember things that had not yet happened. Bisola brought her a basket of yams and 2 small cups of palm oil and sat at her feet on a woven mat. The old woman's hands were thin as dried leaves, and her eyes were the color of weak tea. Bisola asked her what kind of man does not let his wife into his chamber at night. Aya Yemi did not laugh. She did not look surprised. She looked at Bisola for a long, slow moment, and then she asked her only one question. She asked her whether her husband's family had ever, in any generation, made a pact with the river. Bisola said she did not know. The old woman nodded and looked at the ground, and she told Bisola to go home and keep the rule, and to never look. Bisola walked back through the iroko trees with her empty basket swinging at her side. The wind moved in the leaves above her head, and the leaves whispered like rope dragged across stone. She stopped on the path. She listened. The forest grew quiet, as though it had heard itself, and Bisola understood that the trees knew something the village did not. That night, she did not light the lamp. She lay on the cedar bed in the dark with her eyes wide open. The whispering came. The door opened. And whatever was in the corridor entered her chamber for the first time. The air changed. Something cool and dry passed beside the bed. She did not move. She did not breathe. The thing circled her once, slowly, the way a careful guest examines a new room. Then it left. When the rooster crowed, Bisola got up, walked into the corridor, and looked down at the floor. There was a long, faint trail in the dust, swept in a single curving line that led from her chamber door down the corridor and ended at her husband's door. She knelt and touched it. The stone beneath her finger was cool and faintly damp, the way river stones are damp in the early morning. For 3 more nights, she did not enter his chamber. She did not even let herself stand near his door. She kept the rule. But the rule had become a wall between her and the truth, and she had begun to hate the wall more than she feared what was on the other side of it. On the 14th night, she made her decision. She waited until the whispering had crossed back down the corridor and gone into its own chamber. She waited until the corridor was silent. She lit her small clay lamp. She stepped barefoot onto the cool stone floor. She walked past Femi's empty post by the inner garden. She walked past the brass bowl of dying lemons on the side table. She walked past the carved arch of the serpent gates that led from one wing into the next. The lamp shook in her hand the whole way, but her feet did not slow. She stopped at her husband's door. She placed her palm flat against the wood. It was warm, the way a man's chest is warm beneath a sleeping cloth, and for a single breath she almost turned away. She opened the door. The chamber was wide and lit by the soft blue light of a single oil lamp shaped like a coiled snake. A cedar bed sat in the center. The white sheets were thrown back. The pillows were undisturbed. The room smelled of river water and warm earth. And on the floor, in a slow patient coil that filled half the room, lay the largest python Bisola had ever seen. Its scales were honey-colored, marked with deep brown diamonds along its spine. Its body was as thick as her own waist. Its head rested on the white sheets of the cedar bed, and its eyes were the color of warm honey, and they were open, and they were looking at her. Bisola did not scream. She did not run. She stood in the doorway with the lamp shaking in her hand, and she understood, with a clarity that came from somewhere deep inside her bones, that the python was Deji, and Diji had been the python every night since the day she had married him. The python did not move. It did not lift its head. It only watched her with those honey eyes, and in the watching there was no anger, only a deep, terrible sadness, as if she had found a thing he had hoped she would never find, and the finding had broken something between them that could never be mended. Bisola closed the door. She walked back down the long corridor in the dark, the lamp forgotten in her hand. She sat on the edge of her cedar bed in her own chamber. She did not weep. She did not pray. She watched the moon cross the high window slowly, the way a wound watches a clock. When the rooster crowed, she heard human footsteps in the corridor, soft, even, and careful. Diji paused outside her door. He did not knock. He stood there for a long time, and then he walked on. Bisola understood that he knew. The python had eyes. The python had remembered. At breakfast, Diji was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. The food was untouched. His honey eyes lifted to hers, and this time they did not search. They had already found. He asked her, in a voice gentler than any voice she had ever heard, what she had seen. She told him the truth. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a borrowed thing is returned. He told her the story then, in the soft, careful voice of a man who had rehearsed his confession 1,000 times. His great-great-grandfather had been a hunter named Bayo, who had drowned in the river one rainy season and been carried into the spirit world. There, the river goddess had offered him his life back in exchange for a single promise. Each firstborn son of his line, for 7 generations, would belong to her between the hour of the owl and the hour of the rooster. Diji, he said, was the 7th. He told her the river goddess had given his great-great-grandfather wealth beyond imagination, and the wealth had multiplied, generation by generation, until it had become the granite walls and the storehouses and the carved serpents at the gate. None of his fathers had ever married. They had grown old alone. The river had kept its appointment with each of them every night until their final breath. He told her he had married her because she was the first woman he had ever seen who had carried her family on her shoulders the way he had carried his. He had hoped foolishly that the rule would be enough. He had known, the moment her lamp shook in his doorway, that the rule had failed. He told her there was a cost. The river goddess did not allow her secret to be seen. When the rule was broken, a price was always paid, and the price was not chosen by him. It was chosen by her, the goddess. He did not know what it would be. He only knew that it would be something Bisola loved. Bisola did not speak. She rose from the table. She walked through the courtyard. She passed the serpent gates. She walked down the long road past the Iroko trees and into the village, and she did not stop until she reached her father's compound. The door was open. The house was silent. Her mother's mat lay empty in the dim front room. Her 2 younger brothers stood in the small courtyard with red eyes and bare feet. Folklore was nowhere. Their mother had gone to the river that morning to wash a wrapper. Folklore had gone with her. The wrapper had floated downstream, and Folklore had waded in to catch it. Their mother had turned her back for one breath, and when she turned again, Folklore was gone. Not screaming, not splashing. Gone, as though the river had simply opened its hand and closed it again. The whole village searched the banks for 2 days. They dragged the deep places. They walked the riverbed for 2 miles in each direction. They asked the fishermen of the next village. They found no body, no footprint, no torn cloth. They found only Folklare's red coral bracelet, sitting on a flat stone at the water's edge, perfectly dry. Bisola picked up the bracelet. She held it in her palm. It was warm, the way Diji's chamber had been warm, and she closed her fingers around it. She did not weep. She walked back to the granite house through the Iroko trees, and the leaves did not whisper this time. The forest knew what had been taken. The forest had nothing to say. Diji was waiting in the courtyard. He saw the bracelet in her hand, and he understood. He fell to his knees on the polished stone and pressed his forehead to the ground, and he stayed there. Bisola stood above him in her wedding bangles and her silk wrapper, and she felt nothing. The river had hollowed her out and kept the inside. That night, she did not return to her own chamber. She walked into the inner garden and sat beside the small pond at its center. She placed Folklare's coral bracelet on a flat stone at the water's edge, perfectly dry, the way the river had returned it. She spoke to the water. She asked the goddess to take her instead. The water did not answer. The pond was only a pond. The goddess was elsewhere. She returned through the dark hallways of the house. She walked past her own chamber door. She walked the long corridor to Deji's door, and she did not open it. She sat down on the cool stone floor beside it, with her back pressed against the wood. She listened to the slow, patient breathing on the other side. She stayed there until the rooster crowed. When the door opened from within, Deji stood in his human form, dressed in plain white, his honey eyes red. He looked down at her sitting on the cold stone. He asked her, in a voice almost broken, why she had stayed. She told him that whatever he was at night, he was still her husband by morning, and a wife does not leave her husband to grieve alone. He sat down beside her on the stone. They did not touch. They did not speak. The morning light came in slowly through the high windows and made a long pale square on the floor between them. They lived this way for many years. The village called Bisola the luckiest woman in Idiroko. They called her the quiet queen. She fed the poor on Fridays. She paid for the school's new roof. She wore osso oak the color of palm wine on every festival day. She never spoke of Folklore. She never spoke of what crossed the corridor at night. She never had children. The river had taken her one chance at sisterhood, and she did not dare ask the river for anything else. Deji grew older slowly, the way wealthy men do. He continued to read poetry under the lemon tree. He continued to speak softly. He continued to disappear into his chamber every night between the hour of the owl and the hour of the rooster, and Bisola continued to sit on the cool stone floor outside his door, listening to the slow, patient breathing until the morning light returned. She did this every night for 41 years. When Deji died, he died in his human form, in the dining hall mid-sentence, a clay cup of warm cocoa halfway to his mouth. The river had finished with him. The 7 generations were complete. The pact had ended. Bisola buried him in the inner garden, beside the pond, beneath a young Iroko tree she had planted on the day she had given up asking for Folklore back. After the burial, she expected the granite walls to crumble. She expected the storehouses to empty. She expected the wealth to follow Deji into the river. But the wealth stayed. The servants stayed. The carved serpents on the gate stayed, their greenstone eyes still bright, as if the river had decided that Bisola had paid enough for the family to be allowed to keep what it had. She lived alone in the Granite house for 30 more years. She grew old in the slow, careful way wealthy widows do. Her hair turned the color of dry river clay. Her hands grew thin. And her eyes, and this was the thing the village whispered about when they were brave enough to whisper, her eyes had not been the same since the night Folklore had been taken. The pupils were slightly long, slightly upright, slightly slit. Only in certain light. Only if you looked carefully. Only if you knew what to look for. On the last morning of her life, Bisola walked into the inner garden. She knelt beside the pond beneath the now tall Iroko tree, and she placed her thin hand on the flat stone where the coral bracelet had once been returned. She spoke softly to the water. She told the river she was ready. She told the river that if it had ever loved her sister, even a little, it would let her see Folklore one more time before the end. The pond did not stir. The morning was very quiet. A single dragonfly skimmed the surface of the water. And then slowly, beneath the water, Bisola saw a face. A girl's face. 13 years old. Beautiful. Untouched by time. Folklore, exactly as she had been on the morning the river had taken her, looking up at her older sister with eyes that were not afraid, only patient, only waiting. Bisola smiled. She had not smiled in 41 years. She placed her hand on the surface of the water, and Folklore placed her own hand against Bisola's from beneath, palm to palm, separated only by the thin film of the pond. They stayed that way for a long time. The sun rose higher. The dragonfly drifted away. The servants found Bisola later that morning, slumped beside the pond, her hand still resting on the flat stone. Her eyes were closed. There was no fear in her face. There was no grief. The coral bracelet lay on the stone beside her hand, perfectly dry, although no one had seen it returned, and no one in the Granite house remembered who had placed it there. They buried her beside Deji, beneath the Iroko tree. The villagers came in their thousands. They wore white. They wept. They said she had been the kindest woman Iroko had ever known. That night, when the moon climbed above the granite walls, the carved serpents on the gate did not glow. The wealth did not move. The storehouses stayed shut. But in the inner garden, beside the pond, beneath the now tall Iroko tree, the dust on the stone was disturbed in a slow, patient, sweeping curve, and at the water's edge a single set of small footprints, the footprints of a 13-year-old girl, led down into the pond and did not come out. Some say the river goddess never gives anything back. Some say she gave Bisola a single moment, a single touch, a single smile, and then took the smile too, in payment for the looking. Some say the bracelet is still on the stone to this day, perfectly dry, and that any woman who marries into wealth she did not earn would do well to walk past the granite gates of Iroko very quickly, and never look.